Welcome everybody. Welcome to this one more of our conversations in the School of Transnational Governance. I'm very happy that we have today with us Justice Luís Roberto Barroso from the Supreme Court of Brazil, Vice President of the Supreme Court of Brazil at the moment. He's a very well-known and respected lawyer, public lawyer mostly, but now in the Supreme Court, I assume, has to deal with issues that cut across many legal subjects. He has a remarkable career. He did his legal training both in Brazil and the United States at Yale Law School. He then did an outstanding career as an attorney, particularly on issues of public law and fundamental rights. He was appointed to the Supreme Court of Brazil, if I'm not mistaken, in 2013. And he has become one of the most respected voices, not only in that Supreme Court, and not only in Brazil in law, but I think as a justice throughout the world. And I can attest to that because I know the respect he has from many colleagues of other parts of the world. So it's a great pleasure to have him with us today. We will have first a short introduction in light of the great interest that some of the things that are taking place in Brazil and the relationship between judiciary and politics is raising in many respects, and the exercise of the judicial role. A brief introduction by Justice Luís Roberto Barroso of 15 minutes, not more than that, and then we'll have a conversation that will be guided, will be conducted by Professor Sergio Fabrini, whom I thank very much for being with us, though he's almost from the Institute. And he's a professor at Luis University. He's been the director of the School of Government at Luis University. I think you've just finally stepped down.
Yes. No, I just step up.
I stepped up. Sorry.
It's always like that.
And also by Tatiana Falcão, that is one of the fellows here at the School of Transnational Governance. The floor is yours to start.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Miguel. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and talk a little bit about Brazil and about my own career. I'm happy we can do this in English. I would have a problem with Italian. Although, as you all know, when you're not speaking in your native language, you lose all the rhetorical tools you can use in your own language. So when that happens, you better have some ideas. That's when the trouble starts. So I would like to make a quick note on Brazil to start our conversation. Brazil is, as you might know, the fourth largest mass democracy in the world. It's behind only India, Indonesia, and the United States. We just held presidential elections last month, and we had 147 million registered votes, which is quite a remarkable figure. This year, actually in October, the Brazilian Constitution celebrated its 30th anniversary. The endurance of a constitution in Latin America for 30 years is, of course, an achievement that should be highlighted. We have had elections, regular elections in Brazil since 1989. It's quite true that in these 30 years, we have undergone, I could say, rains and thunders and storms. That's for sure. And as we talk right now, the picture doesn't look very. This is a private conversation, yes. Right? The picture.
Well, we are actually.
Oh, okay.
The streaming. So.
Okay. Thanks.
It's a good legal question whether Facebook is public or private, but let's
Okay,
leave it.
okay,
Let's
okay.
assume that it's public.
It's public, it's public. And the picture right now is kind of gloomy, maybe I could say, not due to the elections, which I won't comment, but of course we suffered the trauma of a impeachment. We've been having a prolonged recession. The investigations on corruption have shocked the country. We're having the highest unemployment rate ever. So as I was saying, this is not the brightest moment. Despite this, one thing I would like to do at the outset here is to try to demonstrate that despite the picture of this current moment, the movie of the Brazilian democracy in these past 30 years is a fairly good movie. And so we should not be hypnotized by the gloomy picture of this moment. The three achievements I would like to point out in this conversation are the following. The first one, we've had 30 years of institutional stability. I know this might sound obvious, but not in Latin America and not in Brazil, where we've had this tradition of military outbreaks and breaches of constitutional legality. And 30 years of institutional stability, and note that these have not been ordinary times, Sergio. We've had 2 impeachments, we've had major corruption scandals, but no one considered a solution that was not abiding by the constitutional framework, which is quite remarkable, and only people that didn't know the darkness of a military dictatorship will not appreciate the brightness of living under a constitutional democracy. The second important achievement I would like to highlight is the conquest of monetary stability. It might sound unimportant for an European, but whoever is over 40 in Brazil has lived through the horrors of hyperinflation and how that made life impossible, and how much high inflation impacts the lives of poor people that cannot protect themselves in the financial markets. So part of this abyss of inequality you find in Brazil was to a certain point magnified by the times of hyperinflation. And the third achievement of these 30 years of democracy that I like to point out so that we can start in a positive key is the social inclusion, the inclusion of over 30 million people that left the line of extreme poverty in Brazil in the past 30 years. Very few countries in the world were able to get so many people out of extreme poverty in such a period of time. Maybe only China was able to do that. Besides that, and still in this positive key I'm trying to show here, we've been having a fairly good record in human rights, in freedom of expression, freedom of association, but especially in what regards rights of minorities, we made major improvements regarding women's rights, gays' rights, blacks' rights, native population rights, transgenders' rights. We have a case law at the Supreme Court that is very supportive of minority rights. So, and finishing this first chapter of our conversation, I think the movie of these 30 years of the Brazilian democracy is a fairly good movie, and for that reason we should not be hypnotized by the gloomy picture of the moment. And I have a positive approach and a very optimistic view of the changes that will be occurring in Brazil. Again, nothing to do with elections. It's just because I think that if we look as the events have been unfolding in the past years, I think we are making major changes for good. So I'm not pessimistic at all. That's my way of seeing life. And I was telling Miguel yesterday about this story about the doctor that told his patient, I have bad news for you. I have bad news and I have even worse news for you. So what you want first? And he said, well, give me the bad ones first. And the doctor says, I'm sorry to say, you only have 24 hours of life. And he goes, oh my God, what could be worse than that? And the doctor says, I've been meaning to tell you since yesterday. So, okay. But of course, things have not been positive all the way through. And to give you the correct picture, I would like to say that in these 30 years, I would like to highlight 3 low points in these 30 years. The first one is we have a horrible political system that is responsible for many problems. It's too expensive, it has a low representativeness, and it makes governability very difficult and makes the president hostage of all sorts of clientelism and patronage. The second low point of these 30 years, Sergio, is that Brazil, unfortunately, has become one of the most violent countries in the world. We had, in 2017, 63,000 homicides, which is a very impressive number. And this is a figure that has not entered the radar of the Brazilian society. For one reason, people that die, they're poor, black, uneducated, invisible people that die. And one of the causes for that problem is the politics of drugs in Brazil, which is a major discussion that we must bring to the table. And it's treated in Brazil as a taboo, and it's very difficult to bring new ideas, and we do need to have an original and daring approach to the drug problem in Brazil. That would be an entire different discussion, but I'm just pointing it out. And the third low point during these past 30 years was the unveiling of a structural and systemic corruption that comes from far away, but has suddenly been perceived by Brazilian society as something intolerable. And I would like to spend some time discussing this matter because this has become one of the most important subjects in the Brazilian agenda these days. So, a few words on the struggle against structural and systemic corruption in Brazil. The size and depth of the corruption that was revealed in Brazil in the past years is shameful, to be true. It involved public agents, private companies, state companies, political parties, members of Congress, members of the executive. It's impossible not to be embarrassed by describing what happened in Brazil. Although I think we could be also proud of the courage and the determination with which we are fighting back and trying to overcome this scourge, as I said, that comes from very far away So I think it would be a mistake to try to point to one government or one person. It's a cumulative process that comes from a long time ago. What is very important and very significant in Brazil right now is the reaction of the Brazilian society, which has stopped accepting the unacceptable. And this reaction from the society has brought major changes in attitude, in the institutions, changes in legislation, changes in the case law. Corruption in Brazil was not the byproduct of individual failures or petty human weaknesses. It was a professional scheme of diverting money, public money, to political parties and to members of Congress and members of the state bureaucracy. But the novelty is the reaction of the society. There is in Brazil right now a huge demand for integrity, for idealism, for patriotism. And as you certainly know, that's the energy that shifts paradigms and pushes history in the right direction. Corruption in Brazil was the result of an oligarchic pact celebrated by part of the political class, part of the business class, and part of the state bureaucracy to plunder the state. And it's, as I was saying, novelty that it's been like that for quite a long time, but all of a sudden, society just doesn't accept it. But the oligarchic pact fights back. So at this moment, we are facing all the difficulties and obstacles and hurdles of changing a paradigm that's been there for quite a while. And right now, the struggle against corruption in Brazil faces three main obstacles, I think I could say. First one is that part of the progressive camp in Brazil, to my dismay, thinks that the ends justify the means, and corruption is only a footnote in history. And we shouldn't treat it as something so important. And it's Jacobinism to do what's being done in Brazil. I think they are wrong. Corruption drains the resources that should go to improve public services. Corruption creates a perverted relation between citizenship and the state. And corruption brings about a general atmosphere of distrust in society, which is very bad. So this is the first obstacle, the progressives. The second obstacle are the conservatives. Part of the Brazilian elite thinks that corruption is only bad when it's practiced by my adversaries. But if it's practiced in my favor, or if it's practiced by my companions of poker or dinners or vernissage, it's not a major problem. And with this way of thinking, they empower the extractive elites that hold us back in history and that retain Brazil as a middle-income country. And the third and last obstacle I would like to highlight here are the corrupts themselves. And there you need to deal with two groups. The first one is comprised of the people that don't want to be punished for the wrongdoings they have perpetrated over many years. And that I can understand. Not willing to be punished it's a natural human feeling. But right now in Brazil, there's a worse bunch. People that don't want to become honest, not now or ever, and they would like things to remain just as they've been since the beginning, I would say. Of course, and coming to a close here, all this has impacted the political environment because one of the pillars of democracy is the trust that people place in the institutions. And to win trust, institutions must show integrity, republicanism, and efficiency. And corruption compromises these three values. So we have just emerged from general elections that showed very clearly this lack of confidence that voters at this point have in the political class and in the political institutions. So unsurprisingly, 58 million votes were given to the candidate who was able to impersonate an anti-establishment position, presenting himself as the one that was against everything that's out there. Of course, I cannot make any political remarks, and I'm not a political analyst anyways, but pundits do think that the election of a president that they deemed, I'm not endorsing it, but they deemed to be authoritarian and a right-wing populist, was the reaction of the Brazilian society against three evils that beset Brazil over the past years: corruption, prolonged recession, and high levels of crime. These are distinct problems, but in Brazil they are somehow intertwined, and the elections showed, as I was saying, a reaction of the population against it. So this is the Brazilian moment. Miguel, I think, gives a picture and a flavor of what's going on. We have a 30-year democracy that has resisted many challenges. I'm very confident that it's going to continue to work. I think corruption undermines good governance and brings many problems, including risks including democratic risks because of the discredit it brings to political class and the institutions. But I think that this reaction of society, this huge demand for integrity, means that this could be a moment for a new beginning in Brazil, where refounding of the country with new standards and with a higher ethics.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much in particularly for a refreshing, these days, optimistic view on the world. So we will now have the conversation, and I'm sure it will address topics from fight and against corruption to the issue of the relationships between the judiciary and the political system. And all these while at the same time also addressing some aspects of your career that I think it's also...
I have no secrets. I can tell you everything.
And let's start maybe with Sergio. Maybe you can start with the first question.
Yes, I would say, the Americans say, the making of a constitutional judge. How was your training, and from why you decide to a certain point to become a constitutional lawyer? Why did you don't choose to become a professor full-time, something like that? So, so your career is within the 30 year of democratic stabilization of your country. So was that important, or you just were shocked by the previous experience and you wanted to make the constitutional law, let's say, the feature of your life, the mission of your life? Can you, the making of Luis, how did it develop?
Okay. Well, I think, Sergio, I am the product of a military dictatorship.
Okay.
So I entered law school in 1976 during the military rule, and my first perception of Brazil was I don't want these people in power. So my first contact as an adult with Brazil was to join the mobilization against the military. And that was a wonderful experience, by the way, of organizing peaceful manifestations. It was part of my life when I was 18 to my early 20s. And then I found that constitutional law could be a way to conduct the struggle for democracy and against the dictatorship. And so I started to study it. First, and you're going to like that, my first impulses were very close to political science and to, I did a lot of political reading at that time. I read the classics and I read Marx, a lot of Marx. That was part of my generation. And then I graduated and I decided I wanted to be a law professor, a constitutional law professor. So I read all the canon of constitutional law, Brazilian and foreign, I think I can say. And I was very dissatisfied with the way constitutional law was practiced in Brazil. So in the early 80s, I wrote my first book that gave me some prestige. It was called How to Make the Constitution Work. And I played a role in Brazil trying to develop a constitutional law that was less French, because the way constitutional law was taught in Brazil in the 70s was very attached to political institutions. So it was not a constitutional law by which you would struggle to enforce rights before courts. So I think I was one of the first scholars in Brazil to defend the judicialization of constitutional law. And I spent probably a decade of my life writing about this and traveling the country saying the Constitution should be treated as law, and it can be enforced before courts, and courts should be more daring in enforcing the Constitution. And it worked so well over the years that one of my last writings was about the excessive judicialization of life in Brazil. And so that was the first stage of my academic career, trying to develop a constitutional law that was normative and not that constitutional law that was closer to politics. And this idea of court enforcement of rights and of constitutional norms. Then, after this idea caught up and became the currency, I would say, I dedicated the next stage of my academic production to constitutional interpretation, a less formalist way of interpreting the Constitution. Then in the subsequent phase, after making this marriage between constitutional law and civil procedure, because that's basically what I did, I started studying jurisprudence philosophy again. And there is this movement in Brazil and in other parts of the world of the rapprochement of constitutional law and philosophy, and constitutional law and political science in search for political legitimacy. And I was one of the main scholars that defended this neo-constitutionalism, which is this more proactive role of the courts in enforcing rights and in enforcing the Constitution. And as a lawyer, I was defended before the Supreme Court the gay partnership. I defended researches with embryonic stem cell. I defended the right of women to interrupt pregnancy in case of non-viable fetuses. So in my practice as a lawyer, I kind of tried to make work my theoretical views on constitutional law. So I am happy with the role I was able to play during my life, both as a constitutional law scholar.
How did American experience enter in this
Well,
evolution of your ideas? In a way, you study in Yale, which is one of the bastions of the liberal constitutional thinking.
It was very important. To a certain extent, what I did in Brazil, what I think happened in the world, I'm not sure, I hope you agree with it. There has been, after World War II, in the world, an Americanization of constitutional law. Because before the Second World War, most European countries would follow this French-style constitutionalism that was very close to the description of political institutions. And the pattern in Europe was the supremacy of the parliament, not the supremacy of the constitution. So after the Second World War, starting with Germany and then with Italy, you start to create constitutional courts, and that was basically the victory of the American model, because then you had the possibility of courts or a court-like structure checking the constitutionality of the acts of parliament. And that was basically the American model from the beginning, from Marbury versus Madison that was rendered in 1803. So what I think is that I pushed this new paradigm in Brazil. It happened in Germany during the 50s and 60s, and one of the landmark cases was the Luth case from the late 50s. It hadn't happened in Latin America until the early 80s when I started working this. So to a certain extent, and you were right, this constitutional law that we practice these days in most part of the democratic world is the American model of constitutionalism. Although in the past years they have retrieved from it a little bit. So I think you're right. And going to Yale, of course, was a wonderful experience and a chance to watch how their system worked from the inside.
Tatiana, maybe.
Yeah, so just to keep on that note, one of the greatest criticisms in the role of the judiciary following the two corruption scandals, the Mensalão and the Lava Jato, is that the courts at times have stepped into the executive branch's shoes and created positive legislation through its decision-making power. How do you respond to this criticism, and how do you see the role of the Supreme Court in safeguarding constitutional rights going forward?
That's a wonderful question. We didn't combine. We didn't talk.
I'm trying to match into that.
But that's a great question, because this is kind of hard to it's easy to understand, but people usually make a huge confusion of what's going on in Brazil for whoever is following it. Supreme courts and constitutional courts all over the democratic world, they have two main roles, two main missions. First one is to safeguard the democratic regime, to preserve the democratic rules, even against majorities. And the second role is to protect fundamental rights, also against the majorities when it's the case. Well, these two roles, the Brazilian Supreme Court plays fairly well. with very progressive, relevant decisions that were made over the years in favor, as I was saying, of affirmative actions, of gay rights, of native populations. The problem is that in Brazil, the Supreme Court plays a third role that is not played anywhere else in the world, Tatiana, which is the role of being a criminal court for an enormous array of authorities, including all members of Congress. So the court acts as a trial-level criminal court for authorities. So what happened in Brazil was that with all these corruption scandals, at some point in 2017, there were 500 criminal procedures before the Supreme Court involving politicians. This is what they complain about. So it's not the role, a typical role of a Supreme Court deciding abortion, which is controversial everywhere, but it's not a political crisis. Or gay rights, which is controversial everywhere, but it's not a political crisis. A political crisis is when you arrest the Speaker of the House. A political crisis is when you arrest a senator when he is caught in the act bribing someone. So the judicialization that the politicians complain about is due to this criminal jurisdiction that we shouldn't have in the first place. But once you have it, you need to exercise it. And that's not judicial activism. That's not judicialization. That's just applying the law. So we are not criticized for the decision on gay rights or abortion rights. We are, but that's the normal criticism. The anger that you see against the court is because they say they are interfering with the executive. They are interfering with the legislative. They are criminalizing politics. Well, I think criminalizing politics is terrible, but using politics to commit crimes is also very bad. So this is the main complaint right now, Tatiana. It's not the judicial activism of the Warren Court. It's the judicial activism, quote and unquote, of punishing criminals.
Right. So then, can I just follow up with
Sure.
that? Yeah. There's been a very, very famous quote very recently by a fellow Supreme Court justice of yours. He said that, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, because I had to translate that, the Supreme Federal Court should issue decisions that represent or reflect society's urges. And this was the kind of a thought that was kind of reflected all over the corruption scandals, the Mensalão and the Lava Jato, that the court had this role of reflecting society's urges. How do you see that role interplay with also the other role of the Supreme Court, that is to safeguard constitutional rights and make sure that, you know, all the civil rights and liberties that have been acquired to date are still maintained going forward, even with the change in central government, even as politicians change in parliament? How do you see the Supreme Court safeguarding the Constitution in that respect?
Okay. Who's Brazilian here? Yeah, well, not.
Fairly well represented at the UN.
Yeah. But when I was at the Canada School, like 2 weeks ago, there were like 90% were Brazilian. So here I need to be more didactic. This is a quote of something I said, that
It wasn't actually you. It was Minister Fuchs.
Yeah, but he was saying it after me.
Yeah, that's true.
My quote was, the court cannot be indifferent to the social sentiment.
Right.
And and this is very important and very interesting, especially if you have the protagonism that the Brazilian Supreme Court has at this point. Any power that you exercise in a democracy is representative. Nobody in a democracy exercises power according to his or her own will. You are always supposed to act on behalf and in the interest of society and ultimately of the people. So when you interpret the Constitution, if you have different possibilities of meaning, you ought to choose the one that better answers the demands of society. This is basically what I meant. This is not true, though, for criminal law. In criminal law, the idea of legality has to be respected. So you cannot be creative, or you cannot convict anyone because there is a social demand for that. But if you have different ways of determining the reach and the scope of the Constitution, and if you are a constitutional judge, you should be aware of the demands and of the sentiments of society. And for this reason, in a democracy, even the judicial power is or ought to be exercised according to the will of the people. But the will of the people in constitutional interpretation needs to be filtered by the humanistic reason of the Constitution. But
how do you guarantee that the civil rights that have been gained to date are not violated in light of a new central government? So if you've to date, ever since you came to power in 2013, you've had an extremely left-wing government in power, where it's a lot easier to maintain certain rights, like gender rights, racial rights, LGBT rights. It's a lot easier to safeguard those under a left-wing government than it is under a right-wing government. So how do you see that interplay?
Can I join?
Yes, of course, yeah.
In order to, from a political science point of view, this is a very crucial issue. Where you are talking, I consider two very important contributions. One is Robert Dahl, the father of the pluralistic think, and he wrote an article, a very unusual article in the 1950s, in which he tried to deal with the question, the Supreme Court is a conservative or liberal institution. So the Supreme Court resisted New Deal legislation, opposed, frankly, Delano Roosevelt. Roosevelt threatened the Supreme Court. At the end, the Supreme Court accepted New Deal legislation. So Robert Dahl said, basically, Supreme Court had the role to stabilize political change. So first arrive political change, and then the court makes that political change legitimate. Bruce Ackerman, several decades after, wrote a book on the so famous With the People, the Constitutional Moment, in which Bruce said...
He was my professor.
Okay, good. So Bruce said there are moments in which the political institutions are blocked. There are veto power, there are tension. So it is up to the judiciary to activate change. Indeed, the progressive who were unable to affect the congressional electoral process or to affect the presidency moved to the courts. Trade union, environmental groups moved the court. And the court pushed an activist agenda, right? So for that, the court makes stable, stabilize a previous political change. For Bruce, the court can become activist, can be the functional equivalent of a political actor. So if the court become the the functional equivalent of political actor, does that affect the very identity of the court? Because the court should not be activist, but sometimes it's necessary to be activist. So how do you deal with this dilemma?
Miguel, the questions are very difficult. I want to charge more than I did. So, these are very interesting questions. I think both are right, although it's funny. What happened with the New Deal court? You had a very conservative economic view in the United States that was stemming from what they called the Lochner era. So it was a vision that the state should not interfere in economy. And so the Supreme Court was very faithful to a conservative view that freedom of contract would preclude legislature from creating social rights and protective rights for the workers. So that was the court at the beginning of the New Deal that would strike down all social legislation that Roosevelt was trying to push. So what happened was you had a change of heart in the country and in politics, but the Supreme Court was faithful to the old order and was trying to keep things as they were. Franklin Roosevelt threatened the court with packing it with the new members. It didn't pass, but the court changed its case law. So at that point, it was a conservative court, an active conservative court. So life goes on, and then come the 50s. And Eisenhower, that's ironic, but Eisenhower appoints to the court two brilliant justices. Earl Warren, actually he wasn't a brilliant justice, he was a politician. Earl Warren, and a brilliant jurist who was William Brennan. So they both go to the court. They were appointed by a Republican, conservative president, Dwight Eisenhower, who eventually said, he was asked if he had committed any mistakes during his political career, and he said, actually, I made two, both in the Supreme Court. So Earl Warren, a former Attorney General from California, a man that almost became vice president. He was beaten by Richard Nixon. Well, then he's appointed to the court. And to everyone's surprise, he reveals himself to be a really progressive. And in his first months in court, he articulates Brown versus Board of Education, probably the most progressive decision of the U.S. Supreme Court ever. And it was a unanimous decision, 14-page unanimous decision in favor of ending segregation, racial segregation in public schools. And that's a landmark, of course. So there starts in 1954 a very progressive, active Supreme Court that will last until 1973. Warren stepped out in 1969, but the last decision from the Warren Court, although Burger was the Chief Justice then, was Roe versus Wade, the abortion case in 1973. So from 1954 until 1973, you have a very progressive, liberal Supreme Court. Nixon campaigned for president, saying, I'm going to end this judicial activism in the Supreme Court. So what I'm saying is activism in the role of courts can be conservative or it can be very progressive. When does each role occur? It depends on history, and it depends on the moment of each country, and it depends on the level of legitimacy of majoritarian politics. The Brazilian Supreme Court expanded its role because there is a deficit of legitimacy in the political system. When the political system is with more prestige and more credibility before society, then you usually have the courts retrieve. I think, Sergio, and this is an idea I'm testing. I just wrote a piece that's going to be published in the American Journal of Comparative Law. I have this thesis that Supreme Courts and constitutional courts play three different roles. The first one is generally recognized by constitutional theory, which is called the counter-majoritarian role. It's the possibility that a court will invalidate an act of parliament or an act of the executive. It's called counter-majoritarian because the executive, the head of the executive is elected, the members of Congress are elected, and a board of non-elected judges can impose their will over the other branches. But there are two other roles that constitutional theory usually neglects. First one is the representative role. I was talking about Tatiana. Sometimes the majoritarian political process cannot satisfy people's will, people's demand, for many reasons. And when that happens, you might need a court to satisfy social needs, social demands that were not taken care timely by the political process. To give an American example that people would be more familiar, there was a major decision in 1965 by the U.S. Supreme Court in a case called Griswold versus Connecticut, in which the Supreme Court struck down legislation that prohibited the use of contraceptives in the state of Connecticut. Well, in 1965, with the women's liberation movement going forward, with the sexual revolution, the idea that the state could preclude a woman from taking contraceptives and a doctor from prescribing it was totally unacceptable. But the law was there, and the legislature in Connecticut didn't change the law, didn't revoke the law. So the Supreme Court said it's unconstitutional. That was a quite representative role when it said the legislation does not represent society's will. Another example in the United States was Lawrence versus Texas. At that moment in the 80s, early 80s, although you wouldn't talk about gay marriage yet, the idea that you would treat a gay person as a criminal, as the legislation established, was unacceptable. But the legislation wasn't revoked. So the Supreme Court said you cannot criminalize homosexual relations. That was representative again. It wasn't counter-majoritarian. They were just interpreting a social sentiment. And the third role, so the first one is counter-majoritarian, the second is representative, and the third, and the toughest to justify, but the examples are very powerful, is an enlightened role. Sometimes there are major changes in society that you just can't do through majoritarian politics, especially if you're dealing with minorities' rights. So Brown versus Board of Education is the prototype of an enlightened decision. Enlightened in the sense that it was against the legislature, because the legislature didn't want to pass anti-segregation bills. It was against the majority of the population, that were very racist at that point, but it was a necessary change. And it could only be made through courts, otherwise it wouldn't. One other example in Brazil, gay rights and the right to have the gay partnerships recognized by the state and by legislation. It didn't have support in Congress. It didn't have the support of the majority of society, but it was necessary. And it was a very important change. So once in a while, very rarely, you have situations in which the court has to play this enlightened role, which is to push history beyond the majoritarian political process. I would say another example was in Israel. Is anyone here from Israel? There was legislation that would authorize torture against, quote, terrorists, unquote. And that statute had the support of the population, it had the support of the Knesset, but the Supreme Court, led by a great jurist, Aaron Barak, that's our friend, as Miguel knows, said it's unacceptable torture in any case, no matter who you were dealing with. So again, that was an enlightened decision against the legislature and against the majoritarian sentiment. So these are the three roles that I think at different moments courts play. And just to end this, courts should exercise self-restraint, especially in democracy, in functioning democracies. There are two areas where I think courts should be more proactive. I don't like to use, Sergio, the word activism, because it just assumed a negative connotation. We need another word to identify when it's legitimate and desirable that courts be more expansive. And that's to protect fundamental rights and to protect the rules of the democratic game. In that circumstances, courts should be proactive. In all other cases, I would say, as a rule, it should be self-restraint. What was your question, Tatiana?
No,
On the left versus
left
right
versus
and the
right
interaction
governments,
with
how,
rights.
whether that interferes with civil rights that have already been accomplished
Yeah.
and concrete, or by the court itself. I mean, these are decisions that came out of the Supreme Court.
Courts should not be either on the right or on the left. The role of a court in a democracy, and that's what I think, is to assure that if a progressive party wins the election, it should govern. And if a conservative party wins the election, it should govern. So courts should make sure that in a democracy, whoever wins runs the show. And that could be more to the right or more to the left. And I'm not endorsing that the Workers' Party was on the left.
Yeah.
But
It's a different discussion.
that's a different discussion. What we need to assure, and this is what I've been trying to express in Brazil and share with you here, is that there is one step before government, ideologies, and political parties. You need to have a pact of integrity. I'm going to be honest and decent. And after that, you choose if you're left or right. So ideology comes after integrity. So what I think the courts need to promote right now in Brazil is a pact of integrity and assure that whoever won a democratic election has the right to govern. Here, though, there's a distinction I want to make. One thing is to respect the right of the winner to govern. The other thing is to protect fundamental rights and the rules of democracy. So, speaking about Brazil, I think the gentleman that won has all the right to implement his program. He doesn't have the right to bring setbacks, to conquer fundamental rights, or change the democratic rules. So I don't have anything to do with his government, but I have everything to do with preserving fundamental rights and the rules of the game. And at this point, I have no reasons to think he's going to disrespect the rules of the game. And hopefully he won't be touching the fundamental rights. In Brazil, whoever is watching, the court's been very divided in the struggle against corruption. Half and half. Because there are historical ties between judges and people that are involved in wrongdoings. And it's difficult to untie these ties. But when it comes, I'm not saying that anyone is corrupt. I'm just saying that there are political ties that are difficult to.
Personal loyalties.
Personal loyalties, yeah. That's, which is, we inherited from the Portuguese.
Everything that is bad in Brazil
Family
is
and,
always the fault.
family and friends above right and wrong and country.
Unfortunately, I have to recognize that.
Yeah.
Sadly.
But we are overcoming this, but it takes a while. But when it comes to fundamental rights, the court is very united. Like, we were very pro-women, pro-affirmative action, pro-gays, and even in the case of transgenders, which is an invisible minority that's victim of prejudice all over the world, we had one decision, first in the lower courts, authorizing the surgery for redesignation of sex, authorized in the public system, which was a major step. We have a decision by the court recognizing the right of transgenders to change their names, their social names, to their own self-perception, which was a major change. And there was a case, I was the rapporteur, it's been stayed. It started like 3 years ago, about the right to use the bathroom that corresponds to your self-perception of your sexuality. And when I started the case saying, of course they have this right. Just think if you were a woman being in a man's bathroom or vice versa. That's how a transsexual feels. So when I gave my opinion, my vote, it was kind of a scandal. And 3 justices said, but you mean my wife is going to be in the same bathroom as a travesti? And I said, and that's a good thing, everything is on tape because it's broadcasted in Brazil. And I said, well, let me tell you, a transgender, when he goes to the bathroom, he goes to the bathroom. He's not making a performance there. So yeah, there's no problem that your wife's there. And people were, some of my colleagues were just outraged by the idea. Well, 2.5 years have passed. In this case, will probably come back soon. And I think it's going to be a unanimous vote in favor of the transgenders. So this is an area where progressive thinking has progressed and has conquered majoritarian support. So I don't fear much for fundamental rights, talking about gays and affirmative actions. I fear as a citizen, not as a judge, for environmental protection and Indian rights, native population rights. I think that there could be, I won't say setbacks, but maybe we won't make the progress we need in these areas.
So I wanted to give the opportunity to the general audience to put some questions too. What I'll do is I'll open and we'll collect 3 questions, but Tatiana and Sergio, you can always step into and add something else or make a follow-up question. And by the way, just because we are on record and we have to be so careful these days on the web, on everything, Justice Barroso didn't charge anything for this lecture, except a bistecca at my house.
Yeah, that was wonderful. Wonderful. And some Portuguese wine.
But let's collect three questions. Who wants to start? While you think, I can also put one question in light of what you said, because particularly for those that are not Brazilian, it might come as a novelty and a surprising novelty for many of you, that in Brazil actually it's not only the judgments of the court that are rendered in public, the actual deliberation among the justices takes place in public, what is something almost unique in the world. And so my question to you is, how do you explain that, but also to which extent do you think that impacts in the role of the court, and in a good or a more negative way, or probably in both ways, in light of its very public profile that it acquires in that way? 3 questions.
First of all, Justice Barroso, thank you for your presentation. Thank you for your... Okay. Lucila, lecturer in the University of Helsinki and research at Florence School of Regulation. My question is, goes to putting your presentation in the context of Europe. So today we face an issue of the authoritative countries in Europe, in which the politics actually attacks the Supreme Courts in the sense of, in the ways of reducing the age of retirement or increase the number of ministers of Supreme Courts to affect the way, to influence, one government influence the way the court decided. And my question to you is, what could be the answers of the Supreme Court in certain situations? We don't have European Union, so I would like to hear from you. Thank you.
What's your name again? Lucila. You're Brazilian?
Ricardo Camargo, professor at Universidade Federal do Rio Grande do Sul and attorney of the same state in Brazil. I would like to bring the question that is being nowadays confused, the judgment of the goodness of evilness of a law with the judgment of its conformity or not with the Constitution. How much can it be distinguished? Because it is one of the most difficult frontiers that sometimes I can see in the judgments of the Supreme Court. How much we can see the self-restraint not being denying of justice for one side, and for the other side, how much it couldn't be an invasion of legislative space.
What's your name?
Serkan.
Salkan.
Serkan. I'm from Turkey.
Okay.
Well, it was very nice to hear all your explanations about constitutional thought, because I have been working on constitutional law almost 10 years, and your explanations were wonderful for me to hear within this community. So my question is related to this new idea of constitutionalism of global south. You know, there is this idea that there is a particular constitutionalism in the global south.
Global South.
Global south, yeah. So my question is, as a judge, do you see that Supreme Court of Brazil contributes to this idea of constitutionalism of global south or not? Or do you think that is there a particular constitutionalism of global south in a very general term?
Okay. Okay.
Can I add to Miguel's question
Sure.
very briefly? Because he touched on a topic that I had one question to ask as well about the TV justiça, the TV, the broadcasting of the decisions through TV. And I always wonder whether, well, since this is a career talk, whether you have felt like you were personally restrained in the way that you deliver your decisions because you were being filmed. Because when you talk to judges around Europe, most of the times it would send them shivers down their spines if you said that they were going to be televised while rendering a decision. So how do you see yourself in that position? Because obviously you have to render the decision on TV, so personally as well as, you know, as professionally.
Okay. So I'm going to start with the TV Justiça. It's called Justice TV. And you can watch any judgment live with no editing. And you can watch the hearing, and you can watch the debates, and you can watch the final deliberation. I like to joke, Tatiana, it's the only job on earth that you tell your wife you're going to work, and she can check on television if you're there. So, I am in favor of the Justice TV, but I must acknowledge the downsides. First one, it makes consensus more difficult. Of course, if we are talking in a small group privately, you can say, but you think so? But if you're live on television giving your opinion, it's harder to retrieve and to negotiate in a good sense and to reach a consensus. So I think that's one downside. The other one, it's kind of funny. The opinions became longer. People want to be on television for a longer period of time, which is a mistake. Before I went to the court, I would go quite often to a Jornal das 10, to a TV news program where they would have people comment legal cases. And one thing that you learn when you are on television is that less is more. You better be very objective and as clear as you can. So that's a mistake, but it happens. So people prepared long opinions. And sometimes you're discussing a basic separation of powers case, and they would start with Aristotle, and then they will move through the Roman Empire and the Middle Ages.
That's another Portuguese heritage.
After 45 minutes, they arrive to Montesquieu. And that's halfway. So that's a problem. The opinions got longer. So I'd say those are the downsides. What is the upside? What I really think it's very positive about the Justice TV is that in Latin America, probably as in Turkey, which is a wonderful country, by the way, the social imagination is that behind any closed door, there is something horrible going on. There is some sort of unacceptable negotiation going on. So the image of 11 people, we are 11, discussing, after being prepared, the best solution for an important problem, and discussing sometimes very intensely, it's a good image for justice. It has done good to the court and to Brazil. We have nothing to hide. We discuss things under the light of the day. And that's done it's produced a major favorable impact for the court. The second positive aspect, and it's very human, is if you're going to be on television, you prepare well. And the secret of doing anything well in this life is being well prepared. So once you know you're going to be on television, you want to play well your part. And that has made the public debate in the Supreme Court, and that's a Brazilian circumstance, it's a better debate and it's a more publicized debate than the one you have in Congress. So the Supreme Court session and the arguments that are presented are followed more closely by the press.
You have better ratings than Congress.
So, but especially for the first one, the transparency thing, it has done well to Brazil. So I'm not saying that it should be universalized. I'm not saying it's the best way for any other country, but for Brazil, it has been a good thing. Lucila, politics attacks the Supreme Court, and they speak about reducing age, and they speak about maybe a court packing, as you probably heard. Well, again, there are things that are politics, there are things that involve constitutional rights. I don't think this agenda will move forward. But one thing that I would like to share, and here there are young professionals, and I think that that's a story I would like to share. In life, of course, pragmatism is important, but we should make principled decisions, always. Principles are what free us from the things we cannot foresee. And when you are pragmatic but lacking principles, it ends badly. So look at what happened in Brazil. The Workers' Party was in power. Dilma Rousseff was the president, and she was bound to be reelected. She didn't have a majority in Congress. So what the PMDB, one of the parties that were supporting the government but couldn't stand her, they changed the retirement age at the Supreme Court. It was, you were appointed for life, but you need to retire mandatorily at 70. So they changed the Constitution and raised the age to 75 so that Dilma would not have 2 more appointments to make. I was appointed by her. She made 4 appointments, except for me, very good appointments, I would say. She was very careful, and I respect her for the care she had with the Supreme Court. I don't talk about politics. I only talk about institutions, and I think she was good for the institution. So they raised for 75. As it so happened, she was impeached eventually, stepped out of power, and PMDB got into power with Temer, the current president. She couldn't make the appointments because they had changed the age, and so he missed changing the balance at the Supreme Court in his favor because they misbehaved, as I think they did, against Dilma.
Be aware of what you wish for.
Right. Well, if you, again, in the history of Brazil is full of unprincipled decisions that turn against who didn't follow the principles. In 1993, there was a plebiscite regarding the presidential system or the parliamentary system. As it so happened, the Workers' Party had in its program the parliamentary system, but Lula was the candidate, so they voted against parliamentarism. The PDT, other party, had in its program the parliamentary system, but Brizola also voted for the presidential system because Quercia at that time would be their candidate. The only party that voted for the parliamentary system, because it was in its program, was PSDB, the Social Democrat Party, because they didn't have any candidate. They didn't stand a chance. So they just followed the program. That was in 1993. It happened that in 1994, Fernando Henrique Cardoso becomes the Ministry of Economy. He does a wonderful job. He becomes very popular. He is elected president. And him, that had campaigned for the parliamentary system, was the beneficiary of this hyper-presidentialism that exists in Brazil that was supported by all his adversaries. So they were not principled. He was principled. He got the final trophy. So I like to use these two examples and give them to my students in law school as examples that you should move by principles rather than by immediate interests. And I think these are two powerful examples. What we would need to know, Lucila, is whether these changes are legitimate political choices or if they are violations of the Constitution. As far as changing age, I don't think it's unconstitutional. They've just done it a couple years ago. Court packing would be something different. I hope they won't do it. Argentina has done it. Usually, this is perceived as a non-democratic move, the court packing. So I just forgot now, but I'm prepared for this debate, not for it here. I have all the bad examples of court packing throughout history to show we don't want to follow these bad examples. We want to be better. But Argentina with Perón, with Onganía, and with Menem, they kept changing the Supreme Court. Is anyone from Argentina here? That became a fairly weak court in Argentina, which is a country, by the way, in the beginning of the 20th century, in 1900, Argentina was one of the richest countries in the world compared to European countries, and they just fell behind over the century, probably for things like that also.
Can I sorry.
Sure.
Just the two of them.
Okay.
Then you will have the final question, and then we have to close.
As Ricardo, the goodness or evilness of bill is none of the court's business. Well, the frontier between what is political choices, that is the legislature domain, and what is constitutional interpretation is a blurry frontier, of course. And it's like this all over the world. And usually, who is satisfied with the result says it was good constitutional interpretation. And people that are unhappy with the result say they are invading the legislature sphere. It's like this in Brazil, in the United States, and in South Africa, and there's no way you can avoid this. To point out one decision that I was the rapporteur that was very controversial, it was a criminal case, a habeas corpus, in which a doctor, a woman, and a nurse had been arrested for abortion, voluntary abortion. And there comes the case, and they were in jail, in prison. So I had to decide whether to keep them in prison or not. I'm totally convinced that it's a fundamental right of a woman to terminate pregnancy before the fetus is viable. I don't think the state can send the police, the prosecutor, or a judge to force a woman to remain pregnant of a son she doesn't want. So I can't keep that woman in jail. It's just against my most profound convictions. So I release her. And there was major criticism because they said the law criminalized abortion. But if I think it's a fundamental right, as I think, it does not depend on the law, and the law cannot criminalize a fundamental right. That's the way I think. But, again, people that think abortion should be decriminalized was very supportive of my decision. And people that are, especially for religious reasons, against abortion said I was invading, and I had like 3 or 4 requests for my impeachment due to that decision. So, law and politics are different things, and it should be that way. But there is, in many cases, a border in which they entangle, and it's very hard to say what's what. If you were talking, Selkan, about Venezuela or Bolivia, I don't think that's constitutionalism. This idea of illiberal constitutionalism doesn't catch me. I think constitutionalism is the product of 3 historical movements: contractualism, Enlightenment, and liberalism. So what happened in Venezuela that at a certain point was seen as a model, Venezuela is anyone here from Venezuela? Okay. Yeah. Sorry I didn't know that, but I think Venezuela right now is a humanitarian disaster, the way I see it. So I don't think that's an acceptable political option. It was just an authoritarian move. I know Turkey is going through tough times in this area too. I don't believe in illiberal constitutionalism. I was just in Bogota, in Colombia, in a seminar where the discussion was, is there an illiberal authoritarian constitutionalism? And I just think these are contradiction in terms. So I don't think constitutionalism is an idea that has 2 major pillars: limited power and respect for fundamental rights. And this should be true, should hold true everywhere. So if you're doing something different than this, you're not talking about constitutionalism. So I don't embark in this idea of global South constitutionalism. And I think we should call things for the right names. And a dictatorship is a dictatorship, no matter how it disguises itself.
We've reached our time, but Sergio, I think you
I
have.
just I would like to push this point because I think this is crucial also for in terms of career discussion. Let's start from the point of view of Europe and Italy as part of this question. What you have now is a wind that we call populist wind, saying people will should enter everywhere. Okay, so we have politicians say the European Central Bank should be dependent on popular will. And in Italy, we have the antitrust commissioner has been fired because he was the servant of financial capitalism. Now we want somebody representing people's wills. So what you have from Hungary to Poland to Italy, you have this pressure to transform democracy in popular democracy. So this, I think, call into question a crucial aspect of democratic regime, namely the balance between what is people interest and what is constitutional interest. If you miss the balance between what is proper of democratic process and what is outside the democratic process, should be outside the democratic process, of course, we run into trouble. And indeed, many people think that Erdogan, Putin can be the model. As you know, Viktor Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, say, I am the representative of the illiberal democracy as an alternative to Brussels technocracy, because in Brussels technocracy there is no people. So I think this is to use the jargon of very important pundit, is the battle for death and life of democracy. We arrived to that point. Now, when you talk about constitutional court roles, and about the first one is fine, anti-majoritarian, but then you talk about representative role, and then enlightening role. So what I have the perception is that even the court should be politicized in order to represent the social sentiment, the popular sentiment. So I want to push you, I know that, but I want to be clear on that. So if I look from the perspective of an Italian intellectual or European intellectual, you say, please do not represent the social sentiment, okay? Just represent the Constitution, the basic principle, the fundamental right of the Constitution. I don't want court representing the social sentiment, because the social sentiments change dramatically and can be influenced by powerful political entrepreneurs that bring people from one side to the other side. And through the social sentiments, African Americans were killed for more than a century in south of the United States. And also the enlightening role. I don't want to be enlightened by a judge, even by a constitutional court. I want to be enlightened by a public debate, a free public debate in which people like me can enter in a room and discuss without fearing that Viktor Orban can close my Central European University, or Erdogan can put the journalist in jail. So I think that there is a danger over there that to judicialize the political process and in the same moment to politicize the judicial process. And I think this is a moment in which we have to go back to the fundamental. You should do the judge and protect the Constitution and the liberal principle regardless who is in power. I do the public debate, and I do the public debate in the proper sphere of the public debate. I cannot do public debate in my class when I teach, because this is not the place, as Max Weber said, for profit. Public debate has a specific range where it can be developed. So I want to know, the Justice TV, for me, is a dangerous thing. Okay, I push. I do understand the sentiment of transparency, but I cannot have a television broadcasting my debate in the faculty committee in which I have to discuss whether Miguel can be the director of the transnational school or not. I have to speak within that committee with the freedom to say Miguel is good or bad, not that the students of the European University Institute should follow that debate. Because I am part of the elite, and you have to accept the fact that there are decisions that only elite can take. What I have to do is to account for my decision. To explain, I am in favor of Miguel as director because of that, and that, or vice versa. So if elite give up to their own...
If I disagree with you, that
Yeah,
means
you can.
I would fire Miguel? No.
Be careful about that. So anyway, you push my point. So
I got it.
If the elite and people should be part of a permanent check and balance mechanism, where what I perceive is that elite are giving up and people are expanding too much. So we have a government in Italy where there are ministers who do not know exactly how to cook bistecca, to say that they don't know nothing, and that will be a disaster for the country. So I just to push more that.
So, Sergio, you made a question that could be also almost a question / comment. That could be almost the start of a new seminar. So I have to ask Luis to try to make an effort to contain himself.
No, I go back to the role,
brief,
okay, the role of the Constitutional Court. The second.
So I know that this could open a very long debate again.
Well, there is a book that came out earlier this year that became very popular called How Democracies Die,
Exactly.
in which the authors, they discuss exactly that authoritarianism these days, they don't come from coup d'etat, from military movements overthrowing legitimate governments. The authoritarian wave that you mentioned comes through electoral process. And it's been happening in different parts of the world. And again, respecting the different positions, it's happened in Hungary, in Poland, in Turkey, in Venezuela. There was no military coup there. They were elected. However, there is this illiberal, anti-democratic, or maybe not anti-democratic, since the majority supports them, but anti-constitutional movements. I think I could say, Sergio, that liberal democracy over history has faced this sort of upheavals of reactions, and there has been fascism, Nazism, communism, military dictatorships all over the world, in Latin America and in Africa, and it has resisted. So there have been different waves against liberal democracy over time. The Russian Revolution was one, Nazism in Germany, fascism here, all the military regimes that we had. We had problems in Portugal. We had Salazar for decades in
Record-breaking.
in Portugal. We had Franco in Spain. So it's no novelty that liberal democracy would be under attack. So I don't fear these movements to be true. I think eventually they will dissolve in the air like the others. I think the new threats against liberal democracy comes from progress, comes from the internet, will come from artificial intelligence, and all this digital revolution that's going on. We all had the impression that the internet would make things much better and would even make possible the great dream of a direct democracy. And at this point, we are very scared with what the internet has been doing with all these disinformation campaigns and fake news, as people call it in some other places. So at this moment, under a historical perspective, I would fear more the technological revolution than what's going on in Hungary or in Poland, because as you said, politics changes over time. In Mexico, a left-wing candidate won. So I think that as long as you can keep the rules of democracy in place, you can have governments and different politicians alternating in power, and that is an antidote against authoritarianism, I would say. But, and to end, Miguel, I need to defend my my trilogy of the three roles. What do I mean by a representative role? So I'll give you a very powerful Brazilian example. In Brazil, the 1988 Constitution has a provision stating the presumption of innocence, like many constitutions have. This provision has been construed by the court until 2009 as meaning after the appellate level, if you were convicted in a criminal case, the decision can be executed and you can be arrested after the second degree of judgment. In 2009, the court changed this interpretation to say no one can be arrested before there is a res judicata, before the last appeal is decided. What in Brazil could mean 5 to 10 years if you were playing the higher courts. So this new understanding that prevailed from 2009 until 2016 made a mess in the criminal system because nobody would go to jail, and you had those appeals, pointless, but that would last indefinitely. So in 2016, especially to fight corruption, the court went back to the previous interpretation, saying after the appellate level, you can enforce the decision. That corresponded to a very strong social sentiment in the country against corruption. And it was a fair interpretation of the Constitution. It was a possible and fair interpretation. So you could interpret the language of the Constitution as requiring to wait for the last appeal, or you could interpret it the way we started doing again. So what I mean is, if you have two possible ways of determining the sense of a constitutional provision, and one strongly corresponds to the social sentiment, why not adopt it? Because when you interpret the Constitution according to the social sentiment, that raises your capital, your political capital, for the rare occasions when you need to be counter-majoritarian and go against the social sentiment. So this is what I mean. If you have different possible meanings, they are reasonable, you should follow the social sentiment. That's what I mean by being representative. It's not playing politics. It's interpreting the Constitution in a possible way, legitimate way, that corresponds to the social sentiment. I'll give you an example, powerful again. The way of financing political campaigns in Brazil was a mafia-style system. The political process would never change it. So we had this corrupt system that politics wouldn't change. But the court said this is unconstitutional. There was no other way to satisfy the popular demand for a change but with the intervention of the court. And lastly, the enlightened. It's not the court that is enlightened. It's the Constitution. The Constitution is a product of enlightenment. So to interpret the Constitution, to implement enlightened ideals, is to follow the Constitution, not to follow the court's will. So this is a very interesting point Sergio made, and this is an important point. It's the Constitution that is enlightened. So you need to be able to realize the core of the Constitution, and otherwise you won't make changes. This risk of politicizing the courts or juridicizing politics, well, this has been on forever, since the famous debate between Carl Schmitt and Hans Kelsen about the creation or not of who is going to be the guardian of the Constitution. This is an endless debate. But again, when democratic politics is supported by strong legitimacy, courts won't dare interfere. When democratic legitimacy decreases, sometimes dramatically, then you have the courts supporting democracy when politics is not doing well. I'm not saying this is better. So my main agenda in Brazil is a political reform that can return politics to the center of the stage. I think it's very uncomfortable that the court is, these days in Brazil, one of the protagonists of democracy, of the political process. This is bad, but it's better than not having anyone playing this part in the country. And lastly, the Justice TV model, it has worked for Brazil to a certain extent. And I should say one more thing. It protects us, especially due to our criminal role. I am not subject to the version of any journalist or to the powerful communication system of the government. I conduct an investigation against the president. And I do everything in the light of the day. And when I bring something to the floor of the court, to the discussion, everyone can watch what I'm doing, why I'm doing, and see live my arguments. I have, Sergio, you're not Brazilian, but I've had the good or the bad luck
Nobody's perfect.
of having, I run the investigation against the president. I was the rapporteur in the case that denied Lula the right to dispute the election. I determined the expelling of a popular senator that was caught in a corruption act from PSDB. And right now, at the electoral court, where I'm vice president at the electoral court, I am the responsible for the accounting of the elected president. So if I say not approved, which would, yeah. So the fact that I can do everything in the light of the day, checked directly and live, is very protective. And even this struggle against corruption, people can listen to my arguments. And so I can conquer support that if I was deciding in closed chambers, I would be subject to whatever a journalist would say or speculate that I said, or some of my colleagues would say that I said. So I don't think that I could live, I don't think I could have survived with the role that I play if I couldn't talk directly to Brazilian society. So I'm not saying this should be universalized, but in Brazil right now it's decisive. And one last thing, I try to speak in a language that people will understand, because in law, we have this strange dialect. We say horrible things that nobody understands. So if you are on television, you try to make yourself understood. And that's also, I think, a positive byproduct of TV Justiça. But this enlightened and representative roles, I understand and I do agree that they are controversial, and it's, I wrote this very provocative article trying to make this point. I'll be happy to send it to you.
Thanks.
And, but the points you made are the points that any clever political scientist would make, and they are important and difficult to overcome. I did the best I could. Yeah.
Very good, thanks.
Thank you so much. We largely exceeded our time, but I just hope you'll join me in thanking Justice